As I have previously shown, John Locke's arguments against monarchy are strong when based upon logic, but they fall short when he attempts to ground them upon the doctrines of the Bible. To go further, I contend that his philosophy is itself at odds with the fundamental premises of Christianity. Within this work, I show this to be the case. Where Locke's first treatise is primarily a repudiation of monarchist arguments, his second treatise seeks to provide a basis for governance by the consent of the people. His core contentions can be summarized as follows. Human beings are not originally subordinated to one another until they are subordinated, either by force or consent. This state of original insubordination he calls the state of nature, in which all humans are free of one another and equal with respect to one another. This equality does not consist of any type of equality whatsoever. It is not an equality of ability, merit, or virtue, but rather it is specifically an equality with respect to a jurisdiction or dominion of one man over another. Likewise, Locke argues that this liberty does not consist of freedom to do anything whatsoever. It is not a freedom from the laws of nature, nor is it a freedom from moral law. Rather, in Locke's account, it is a freedom of human beings from the depredations of others. In this, Locke makes the distinction between liberty and license, as well as another distinction between the state of nature and the state of war. Whenever a man seeks to bring another totally under his power, to deprive him of his autonomy over his person and possessions, he is not acting within the liberty of the state of nature, but rather he has left the state of nature and entered a state of war against his fellow humans. To avoid the depredations of those who would seek to enter into such a relationship with others, human beings voluntarily join themselves into civil societies which possess laws which prohibit and prescribe punishments for such behaviors. Since the purpose of these civil societies is to preserve the natural liberty of man, it would be a rather poor investment for individuals to place themselves under an authority that is no different from the brigands from whom they sought to escape. As such, whenever any part of that civil society seeks to alien any of the natural liberties of the people, they dissolve the state of civil society, entering into a state of war against those whom they have sought to oppress. All of this rests upon a core set of moral premises: that human beings are entitled to autonomy over themselves and their property, and that justice consists of proportionate retribution against any who would seek to violate that autonomy. That these are required by our nature in order for us to achieve, in his words, a life fit for the dignity of man. And it is here, at the very root of his philosophy, where he immediately departs from the scriptures. There is nothing within the scriptures that upholds the notion that man, by his nature, possesses a right to his autonomy, nor is there anything within the scriptures that validates the notion that government is by the consent of the governed. The Bible teaches that the lot of the slave is to serve their master, the lot of the subject is to serve their lord, and the lot of mankind is to bend the knee to a cosmic tyrant. Furthermore, there is nothing within the scriptures that constitutes a consistent or a coherent endorsement of proportional retributive justice. Yes, it is true that it was written, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but we also see intergenerational punishments and genocides explicitly endorsed by God. Of course, standing in contrast to this, we are also told, supposedly by God, not to seek vengeance, that wrongs are to be suffered meekly in life. We are told to turn the other cheek, and that vengeance belongs to God, and that he shall repay. And in what manner is this vengeance to be carried out? It shall be meted out in the most infinitely disproportionate manner, an eternal cosmic torture chamber. None of these stances are compatible with a concept of proportionate retribution. If we are to punish innocents for the crimes of the guilty, our retribution is not proportionate. If we are to simply content ourselves with not pursuing justice, then there is no retribution, the lack of which is obviously disproportionate to the commission of violations of the rights of the innocent. And there are few claims that would match the absurdity and abhorrence of the claim that eternal torture for actions carried out within a finite span of time is somehow proportionate to the crime. especially when that so-called crime is nothing more than a refusal to worship the being that would commit such an atrocity. Of course, I could simply stop here, as this severs any link that his philosophy might have had with Christianity. That being said, I shall hammer the point home further by delving into the numerous particularities in which his claims further depart from Scripture. With regards to familial relationships, Locke's account of parental power is entirely inconsistent with Scripture. To Locke, the father's command over his children is but temporary, and reaches not their life or property. It is but a help to the weakness and imperfection of their non-age, a discipline necessary for their education. Contrast with Scripture, and you get a very different story. As I pointed out in my previous work, the Scriptures do, in fact, uphold a right of parents to kill their children if they find them to be rebellious. Clearly, the Scriptures do, in fact, preach that the parental authority does, in fact, entail dominion over their very lives. So here we can see that the Scriptures contradict Locke's point of view. And when we look to Locke's account of conjugal society, we see that it is also entirely inconsistent with Scripture. For him, it is a voluntary compact between a man and a woman. It is due to this fact that he recognizes a right of women to divorce their husbands and to dissolve a marriage. This is not supported by Scripture. Women are given no choice in biblical laws governing marriage. Rather, they are treated as property. When it comes to slavery, Locke attempts to preempt scriptural arguments against his position by characterizing slavery in ancient Israel as not true slavery at all, but merely drudgery. Locke points out that masters did not possess complete domination over their slaves, and that there were laws in place limiting what masters could or could not do with those enslaved to them. Masters could not kill their slaves, they could not maim their slaves, and they were required to release their slaves after every 7-year period. What Locke does not recognize is that those laws only applied to male Hebrew slaves. Slaves that were either purchased or taken from the surrounding nations were their master's property. They could be passed down from father to son as inherited property, and they were slaves for as long as their masters wished. Yes, the passage does stipulate that the Israelites are not to rule over their brethren cruelly and ruthlessly, but no such exhortation is made on behalf of the foreign captive. Whenever the Israelites waged war against a foreign city, the process laid out by their laws is such that if the inhabitants surrender, the entire population of the city shall be subject to forced labor. But if the city resists, then all the men of the city shall be put to the sword, and the women and the children are to be enslaved. Women, Hebrew or otherwise, who were enslaved were not to be freed at the end of the 7-year period. A Hebrew woman sold as a slave could be coerced into sexual relations with her master, and her master could give her to his son. While yes, some apologists would point to the rules that require that her master feed, clothe, and treat her as either a spouse or a daughter, the fact of the matter is that her consent is never once considered throughout these laws at all. And freedom to choose is fundamental to human dignity. Likewise, foreign women taken captive in war could be coerced into so-called marriages. Of course, there was ritual surrounding the practice. They were to shave their heads and trim their nails, and they were to be given a month to mourn the slaughter of their parents. But after this process is complete, their captors were free to take them as their wives. Again, no room is made for these poor girls to choose. Their autonomy in the matter is entirely absent. The only provision allowed for their release is if their masters were unpleased with them, putting them at the arbitrary whims of those who butchered their families. And what of the rights of male Hebrew slaves? While true, an Israelite man was not automatically enslaved for life, if he had any children whilst enslaved, his wife and children were to remain property of the master. if his master was not willing to free them. The only recourse left for him was to accept lifelong servitude. And yes, while it is true that masters could not maim or kill their slaves, they were free to beat them as long as they were able to resume their duties within a few days. Clearly, slaves in the Bible were indeed slaves. While yes, some were better off than others, particularly if they happened to be Israelite men, the fact of the matter remains that they were not free people. Locke, of course, possesses a vested interest in downplaying the enslaved state of those kept in bondage by the Israelites, as he is attempting to sell freedom to a people who believe in the veracity of scriptures that advocate slavery. Locke holds that the only legitimate form of slavery is in the enslavement of war captives taken in a just war. Such an enslavement is only moral, in his eyes, if those captives took part in fighting for an evil cause. In his eyes, they have forfeited their lives and liberties by seeking to violate the lives and liberties of others. In his words, the conqueror gets no power, but only over those who have actually assisted, concurred, or consented to that unjust force that is used against him. This point of view is clearly not corroborated by the Bible. Locke contends that absolute monarchs necessarily exist outside of civil societies, as there is no appeal on earth against any harm that one may receive from him, other than an appeal to the sword. He calls brutes those who had the temerity to argue that the king has a right to do that whichever he pleases because he is king. In this regard, Locke is at his height. There is little cowardice greater than that held by those who, out of fear, seek to vest dominion over the lives and fortunes of others into the hands of absolute, unaccountable power. In his words, men are so foolish that they take care to avoid what mischiefs may be done them by polecats or foxes, but are content, nay, think it safety, to be devoured by lions. What Locke does not recognize, however, is that this very same challenge can be laid at the feet of those who argue for the absolute dominion of God over man. No valid reason is ever given demonstrating the legitimacy of God's dictatorship. Never is it ever shown that it is somehow different for this celestial monarch to subjugate and terrify mankind. I hold that all arguments making the distinction between tyrannies on earth and the tyranny of heaven are nothing more than so much special pleading. That if we are to take the unrestrained nature of absolute power as the very reason for its abolition, so too ought we to oppose the tyranny of heaven. Just as the only recourse for men who desire to be free of an earthly monarch is an appeal to the sword, so too is such a course of action the just and proper response to a cosmic tyranny. Locke's account of the moral rights of mankind is not only far more noble than the doctrines of the Christian scriptures, it is directly incompatible with them. Taking his standard consistently, God himself has entered into a state of war against mankind, as he has sought to bring us totally within his power. Do I hear bleating about how it is foolish to oppose an all-powerful God? I contend that the likelihood of success for a noble cause is not the properly deciding factor one should consider when going to war. That to bend the knee, purely out of fear, is nothing but the coward's path. There is no crusade more just, more sacred than one for liberty. If man possesses rights, they are not privileges given to him by a government, regardless as to whether that government is on earth or in heaven.